Hello, welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 186, and I'm the show's host, Kyle. On today's show, I have a lot of current events to cover, stuff from at home, more spending on more new weapons. I got some stuff on Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, Somalia, Israel, Yemen, so we'll have plenty to talk about in today's show. For those of you who would like to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com and libertarianinstitute.org. So one thing I wanted to talk about, I read an interesting article that I'll link to in the show notes page that talks about resurgence in cluster munitions. Now, cluster munitions, cluster bombs, are weapons that explode and then drop what they call bomblets. And I believe the international law definition says that bomblets are less than 44 pounds. And I believe the bomb would have to drop like 15 or 20 of those at the very least to be called a cluster bomb. Now, these bomblets have a high rate of not exploding. And so if you think about what happens here, you'll drop, I don't know how many, 50 of them in an area. Maybe 30 of them explode, kick up a lot of dust, dirt, and debris, and then that debris falls, and the ones that don't explode remain under the dust, dirt, and debris. Sometimes they don't explode ever, sometimes they don't explode for a while. We're really seeing the impacts of this down the road in Cambodia and Vietnam, where they were used in the 60s and I guess early 70s, where farmers in Cambodia today have problems where they're driving their tractors, plowing their fields, and then they hit one of these little bomblets. It could destroy farm equipment. I'm sure people have died from it. Little children have lost arms. These look like shiny, fun little objects. Who doesn't want to pick up a ball and throw it as a little kid? Sometimes they pick it up, rattle it around, and kaboom. And, this kills children. It blows off their arms, permanently dismembering them, disfiguring them, and, making their lives horrible. And, these aren't even the children that were alive during the war. They're the children, at this point, even it could be the children of the children of the people that were alive during the war have no sin in the war whatsoever. Of course, the most recent use of cluster munitions, I believe, has been in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. They were definitely doing this in 2016, using cluster bombs around Yemen. This has resulted in, people down the road. I believe one child lost a leg from stepping on one of these weapons. So I believe the new Russian cluster munition sounds really crazy that it would explode and pop into like 15 larger heat-seeking or guided weapons, and so it sounds like a really crazy weapon that the Russians are developing there. More money wasted on weapons as the U.S. Navy is rolling out their new drone warships. I'm sure these cost a lot of money, and I don't know if they're effective weapons or not. I really haven't read any reports on that. However, I do know that the United States is $20 trillion in debt, and that we can make peace with the other countries of the world if we so chose. It's our politicians' desire and the weapons maker desire and the fever created by nationalism and tons of other causes that lead the United States to provoke hostile conflicts with other countries, to get involved in Iraq and Syria and Libya and pit fights with Russia and sanction China and North Korea and do all these crazy, stupid, and unneeded things. And so there's simply not money to develop these drone warships. And at this point, people need to start making that calculation, realizing that we cannot afford the empire anymore. The idea that we could modernize the warships with a bloated Pentagon and politicians who take large portions of their campaign contributions from weapon makers are not going to make the correct choices and are not going to get good deals for the American people. And the empire is just unsustainable. So it's time to start making peace. That way we could, spend some money at home or start to pay down the debt. Sexual abuse has been a problem in the military, and this has been documented pretty well. And I think most people are aware of it, although there's not that kind of condemnation you would get if, let's say, this was some sort of company. If there was widespread sexual abuse at, let's say, like a Hooters restaurant or a Walmart. That would be a huge scandal that may require, if it didn't kill the company, possibly require the CEO to step down. But when you get these scandals coming out in the military, you don't have, let's say, Ashton Carter being forced out. Now, a 2017 report, the most recent one now, said that there was a 10% increase in the reports of sexual abuse. Now, I guess this isn't necessarily a negative thing if it's because that there's more acceptance for the victims of sexual abuse and they're feeling heard, and like if they come forward, they won't be targeted for it, then that could, explain the increase here. But at the same time, it's disturbing that the numbers are so high. So the House has released their own version of the AUMF. I talked about the Senate version in a previous episode, and I'll link to that in the show notes page. From my understanding, I haven't had a chance to read the House bill yet, but it's pretty similar to the Senate bill, except it includes one important thing, and that is a sunset. A sunset means that the bill that the AUMF at some point in time in the future will require the Congress to act and vote in favor of another AUMF for it to continue. The Senate bill is much more passive, where the Senate could vote, or I believe the Congress in full would have to vote, and could then stop the war, but congressional inaction would seem to only continue it. However, the House sunset is 5 years, which is way too long. I guess, if you had a pit between the two, there is a clear winner with one having the sunset and one not having the sunset, but neither is a choice, you want to make. It's like Hillary and Donald Trump or something like that. Speaking of Donald Trump, made some statements on Kim Jong-un saying he is a very honorable man. Good thing to hear, because the mainstream narrative against Kim Jong-un right now is that Trump is going to get tricked by him. Of course, I played the clip on this show where you have John Bolton saying, how do you tell if a North Korean is lying? If their mouth is moving. And this is certainly the narrative of pretty much everybody in the mainstream media who isn't just unapologetically pro-Trump, or maybe Tucker Carlson. But, the South Koreans or North Koreans have made some real concessions here, and does look like we're moving in the right direction on this issue. Let's hope Trump continues to not listen to John Bolton. Syria. OPCW inspectors returned to Duma to, gather more evidence. I haven't figured out why yet, if they missed something the first time around, if they got new information. I've read several people on Twitter saying that they're worried that this is some kind of setup to allow for them to maybe have collected planted evidence or something like that in order to justify either the Western position or the Russian position. Russia plans to deliver the S-300 missile systems to Syria soon. The S-300s are surface-to-air missiles and would apparently be pretty effective against Israeli aircraft. Now, I've read reports that they say, the F-35 could, avoid the missiles or the radars from the S-300s. However, those radars would collect data on the F-35, even if they couldn't track them enough to shoot a missile at them or detect them instantly. And the more you gather data on the stealth aircraft, I've talked about this before on the show, the better the radars are able to identify them. And so I'm sure the Americans wouldn't be too happy if the Israelis were flying the F-35s within reach of these S-300 radars. And other Israeli aircraft, I believe, would be pretty susceptible to these surface-to-air missiles here. Now, initially, these missiles are going to be operated by Russian soldiers, but then the use of them would be transferred over to the Syrian soldiers. At least for the initial portion of this systems being delivered, it seems that these would not be targets for Western countries. Now, Israel, I don't know, maybe they would go after them even with the Russians there. But, that would provoke a larger confrontation with Russia. And so it would be, problematic, at least in the early days of the delivery of the S-300s for anybody to attack those missile systems. And so this may be a real deterrent from having so many Israeli strikes against Hezbollah, Iranian, or Assad targets in Syria. Seems like Trump is continuing to move away from his statement that he wants the United States to leave Syria. As I mentioned on the last show, there's a new air base in northeast Syria. And I keep seeing this narrative come out, and I know I talked about this on the show in the past, but I think it's really important because I think this is the coming lie on Syria. And that is, the Syrian opposition is made up of jihadists. Now, didn't hear this for at least the first 6 years of the Syrian civil war, very rarely, unless from alternative media sources. But now I'm starting to read it more and more in the mainstream media that, hey, there's 50,000 jihadist fighters in the Idlib province of Syria. Now, this is the remnants of the Syrian resistance to Assad that the United States provided training, weapons, and funding for. And while the fighters that the U.S. may not have directly backed were these groups either joined the jihadist groups, these groups sold their weapons to the jihadist groups, or they were simply taken from them. So now there's a massive army of jihadist-linked fighters in the Idlib province of Syria, and it's all the United States' fault. We armed, we backed these groups, we made it possible for these groups to grow, And now we're saying, oh my God, there's a bunch of jihadists over there and we have to do something about it. Now, of course, the international, or the sovereign state that has the most influence over this area is Turkey. And I haven't seen anyone call on Turkey to start mopping up these jihadists that are living in Idlib, when they seem to have no problem with Turkey invading other areas of Syria, whether it's controlled by ISIS or the YPG. And so I think as the ISIS excuse in Syria dries up, although the U.S. seems to be doing whatever they can to preserve the ISIS enclaves that still exist. I know Assad isn't necessarily actively pursuing the ISIS fires in the Syrian steppe, which is a large portion of the Syrian desert there. He is pursuing other rebel groups around Syria, including one of the focuses of the Assad government right now is a Palestinian refugee camp just south of Damascus that's half held by ISIS and half held by Al-Qaeda. And there's been some deals reached and some rumors reported, and some of the fighters have been evacuated, but right now it seems like Assad is dropping bombs and looking to, liberate the area. Moving on to Libya, which, of course, right before Syria was destabilized by the Obama-Hillary war there. That war created a power vacuum in which General Haftar, as I believe how you say his name, was able to take control of about half of the eastern portion of the country and isn't a member of the UN-backed government there. The UN backs the government that the U.S. says they support, but that government's opposed by the Haftar government. Now, Haftar is 75 years old. He was once a CIA stew in a coup plot decades ago and spent decades living in the United States after, but he ended up in a Paris hospital for medical treatment and then returned to Libya. I found that he returned being awfully odd. I mean, I would have thought that because he opposes the UN-backed government and because his forces have certainly committed war crimes, just like all the forces in Libya. I don't want to say that he is uniquely horrific for a ruler in Libya, but horrific all the same. Now, there are elections coming up in Libya. Maybe that has something to do with everybody seeming to be okay with General Haftar leaving and then re-entering the country. And it does seem like his government doesn't actively fight against the UN-backed government all that much these days, and mostly all the governments that are, trying to deal with their own militia problems. The airport in Tripoli, I believe there were French officials in the airport in Tripoli, or UN officials, and it was actually shelled by a militia group there. And Benghazi certainly has militia groups in it, and so all these warlords have enough work to do in their own territory to worry about fighting each other so far. In Afghanistan, we have the Taliban announcing the start to their yearly spring offensive. Me and Will discussed what the potential possibilities from here were in our article that was published on Consortium News about the Afghan opium crop. I've got a link to that article in the show notes page for those of you who want to read that. There's been a pretty interesting story falling out of Somalia, and I'm going to just update it the best that I can. A UAE plane landed in the capital of Somalia, Mogadishu, and apparently that plane was headed to an area of Somalia known as Puntland. Now, that area is backed by the UAE in a lot of ways, and is somewhat an autonomous region of Somalia, excuse me. The plane that was stopped had, I believe, $13 million in it, and this really upset the Somali government, wondering why they weren't, being informed that kind of money was going to Puntland. So they stole the money. The UAE responded by cutting relations with the Somali government, although there's some demands that they remain attached to the Puntland government. And this has resulted in some skirmishes between rival factions of the Somali army. Some loyal to the UAE and some loyal to the government in Mogadishu. So a very interesting story there. Somalia, of course, is, I think, a very interesting story in how it's been impacted by the U.S. foreign policy, and I'm going to link to an episode that me and Will Porter did on the Peace and Liberty podcast with Stephen Clyde, where we discuss both Somalia and Libya, and I think we do a pretty good job of covering how terrible the U.S. intervention has been for those people. Israel, on the day the podcast will air Friday, we should have the next round of return march protests by the people of Gaza. I think they have 2 or 3 more weeks planned of this. where they're protesting every Friday. Of course, the protesting so far has killed, I believe, over 35 now, including a second journalist who just died from Israeli sniper wounds. It's amazing. Had this been happening anywhere else, this would be all over the media. Again, for me, I think the best example would be something like the migrant caravan coming up through Mexico. And imagine if Trump had ordered a bunch of National Guard snipers down to the border, and then he told those snipers to target the ankles of the people as they were, trying to cross a bridge or a river into the United States. And then some of those snipers killed 15-year-olds. And the Trump government response was that, all of our shots are where they intended to be, strongly suggesting that they're intentionally killing children. People will be horrified. People will be outraged. Rightly so. But that isn't the case here. In fact, Natalie Portman, who I guess is refusing a Israeli citizenship award of some kind because of in part, the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians. And from what I could tell, Natalie Portman's stance isn't all that radical here. It certainly isn't anywhere near what my stance on the issue is. And she's basically just saying, hey, we're treating some people that live in Gaza and the West Bank really poorly. And, I'm not a fan of the Netanyahu government. And, there's people calling for her citizenship to be revoked. There's people calling her an anti-Semite, and there's just a really strong, insane reaction. Last thing I'm going to talk about on today's show is Yemen. The Houthis seem to be increasingly targeting Aramco sites in Saudi Arabia. And I'm not sure why these sites are suddenly being targeted as compared to the airport in Riyadh or the Saudi palace. One possible reason is that the Houthis may be running out of missiles because they just are converting old Scud missiles. And so they're launching rockets. And I believe one even hit a Aramco ship, which is the Saudi oil company, off the coast of Yemen. But it didn't cause an oil leak. And so I guess these rockets are pretty small and not super effective. But I'm guessing that we're going to continue to see claims that Iran is backing these attacks, that Iran is providing the weapons for these attacks. And, this is going to be increasingly important. Obviously, I believe May 12th is the day that Trump is going to have to recertify the sanction waivers to Iran as part of the nuclear agreement. And so I'm guessing we're going to start to see the burners turned up on Iran's role in Yemen, claiming that basically the Houthi rebellion is being funded by Iran and they're providing the weapons. And this is absolutely untrue. Food cannot come into Yemen. The one thing there isn't a shortage of in Yemen, though, is weapons. I believe prior to the start of the Civil War, Scott Horton has talked about this on his show. And I believe I heard this on Moderate Rebels as well, that after the United States and Iraq, Yemen had the highest personal arms ownership per capita of any country in the world. And so they don't need weapons from Iran. Iran. The United States had given Saleh a lot of weapons. The USSR and North Korea had sold the Yemenis a lot of weapons. The weapons were there. Now they're being used. And they're being used against Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia and the United States and Israel are taking that opportunity to demonize Iran for that. But it's really not Iran. All right, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Maybe next week. I need to do a show on the Iran deal and just recertification. I know I've done shows before on it in the past, but this is going to be a big topic coming up. There's always a lot of demonization of Iran going on in the mainstream media, but it looks like, this is always increased around the times where there's a decision to be made on Iran. If you want to share the show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org. You can find the show there, and you can find my daily news roundup there. My news website is immersionnews.com, at KYAAALE on Twitter, Immersion News on YouTube, BitChute, and Minds, Libertarian Union on Facebook. Thanks, everyone.